continuing my read through of the Bible with the fourth book of the Bible, the book of Numbers. Now, before we dive into it, I'm just going to briefly lay out some housekeeping details. Almost all stuff I've talked about before in previous videos, so I'll try and get through it as quickly as possible. But I think it is good to just reiterate this at the beginning of every video, just to give my background. I grew up in a religious environment. I went to church every Sunday, Sunday school every Sunday, youth group every Wednesday. I went to private Christian schools where we studied the Bible every day as a school subject, just like math or science would be studied. So this is not my first time reading through this, but it is my first time revisiting it as an adult, or at least the first time revisiting it cover to cover. I no longer consider myself a Christian. I now consider myself an agnostic, and I am critical of some of the stuff in the Bible, but I do not want this reread review series to be just criticism of the Bible. I feel like I've already done that in my late 20s and 30s when I went through my Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins phase. And now I just want to examine this as history, as literature, as stories, and get into the more interesting aspects of it, and try not to be too heavy-handed on the Christopher Hitchens, the Bible is terrible type angle to it. Although there are definitely a number of problematic parts in the book of Numbers. And in fact, speaking of Christopher Hitchens, some of the favorite things he loves to talk about are in this very book. So we'll talk about it as it comes up, but I'm going to try not to be too heavy-handed about it. That's my goal for this whole series. It strikes me looking back, like in my reviews of Exodus and Leviticus, I didn't stick to this goal very well. I may have been a little bit too heavy-handed on the criticism. My goal is to avoid that for the book of Numbers, but I'm doing these all unscripted, so we'll see how we go on that. Let me know how I do. Another brief housekeeping detail. I'm reading this out of the Jerusalem Bible, the Reader's Edition. This was not the edition I grew up with. I grew up studying the NIV, but I've been reading the Jerusalem Bible mostly just because this was the only edition I could find to order out here in Vietnam. This is a Catholic edition of the Bible. The original Jerusalem Bible apparently was quite famous for its extensive footnotes. The Reader's Edition only has a few footnotes. And I'll talk about them as they come up. They're interesting to me because they were different than the footnotes I grew up with on the NIV. So let's just try and jump into this here. So again, I'm going to try and avoid being overly skeptical of this and just talk about this as maybe a reading experience. Now, sorry, I'm going to mention one more thing, which is a bit of a repeat from previous videos, but it's something that I've been noticing more and more, which is something Christine Hayes talked about in her lecture series on the Old Testament, which is the art of biblical narrative, which means that the writers of this book are choosing a narrative style which is very light on the details. It sketches events only in their bare bones details. It does not fill in any of the details, and it leaves a lot of things ambiguous. This is the narrative style which is throughout the historical narrative of the Old Testament. And it's worth just keeping that in mind, because there are going to be a number of things when we go through here that are not at all clear what the interpretation is. And the interpretation could go many different ways. Now, this is something, I think this is something that I've really been noticing in my reread of the Bible. Definitely, I remember studying this when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and finding often the Bible difficult to decode on its own terms. But we were studying this under the guidance of the pastor or the guidance of our Bible school teachers, who, when we would get to a part that was difficult for us to interpret, they would provide us with their interpretation of it, which gave me the impression that it was possible to decode this. You just had to study it enough. But I've been realizing on my reread that there actually is not any one right way to interpret this. I noticed this with the book of Genesis, and I've been noticing this throughout. Every time without fail that you get to a passage where the meaning seems to be a little bit ambiguous, you can bet money that if you go and you look up the commentary on it, nobody's going to agree on what it means. There's going to be like 20 different interpretations and all these rabbinic traditions and all these Christian theologians and Bible scholars are going to debate the meaning of the Hebrew. And to a certain extent, it can be interesting. But I'm choosing to do this as a casual read through. So I have not gone through the rabbit holes on all of this, although there are a few different passages where I have gotten into it, and I'll try and highlight that as I go through and talk about this. Just stuff that happened to be of interest to me. But the other thing to just keep in mind is that is a narrative choice that the authors of this document have made. And it has to be treated on those terms. Now, there are many times when I find this frustrating. But the way to look at this, and Professor Grant Vault talked about this a little bit in his History of World Literature, in which he included the Old Testament as part of the canon of world literature. The fact that every passage needs to be interpreted is part of the fun, in a way, if fun is the right word. The authors of this text are inviting you to co-create the meaning with them. So what do these passages mean? Well, you could say this, or you could say that, and you're kind of, in your mind, creating the meaning of this. And I don't know. It's frustrating a little bit for people like me who don't like that ambiguity. But if you want a version of these stories where the details are interpreted for you and there's no ambiguity, those versions are out there. Those are like the retellings of Bible stories that we grew up with as kids. If you grew up in the Christian church, like the ones I'm talking about, like the illustrated ones that have a version of the Bible story, but it's rewritten in a way that makes sense and where kind of the narrative gaps are filled in. So that stuff is out there if you're desiring a version of these stories where somebody is making those narrative choices for you. Otherwise, these are the bare bones of the story from which different people will take different interpretations. So I want to emphasize that because I think that's going to be that's one thing I really have realized on my rereading of the Bible. There is no answer to these questions. There's no one way to interpret this. And that's something that's going to be coming up again and again, I think, as we look at some of these confusing passages. Okay, so with that as background, I'm going to try and narrate this through talking about the reading experience. The book of Numbers is the fourth book of what is called the Pentateuch, or the Torah, or the books of the law. I always, when I was a kid growing up in Bible school, I always thought that was a little bit of a misnomer, the books of the law, because it is also a narrative. But the narrative is mixed in with the law in a way that doesn't really make sense to me. Leviticus is almost all law. Genesis is almost all narrative. But then we get into Numbers, and Numbers is mixing in narrative and law, as well as the census, which I suspect is where Numbers comes from, is the census. There are two censuses censuses in the books of Numbers. One at the beginning and one near the ending. So the census officials, statute of Levites, the orders of tribes. I remember reading this as a kid, and in addition to studying this in school, I read through the Bible every night for my own devotions. And I remember struggling to stay awake for these sections and just struggling to keep focused. And you know, not to do that thing where your eyes are reading over the text, but your brain has stopped paying attention, to really pay attention and absorb all these names. Not because at this point I believe it's sacred scripture, but that's just to be an active reader. But it is really difficult to stay focused on these pages. The tribe of Zebulun, leader of the sons of Zebulun, Eliab, son of Helon. His command, 57,400 men. The assembled strength of the camp of Judah, numbers in all, 186,400. These are to be first in the order of breaking camp. On the south side, the standard of the camp of Reuben and the battle array, blah, 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 blah. Just goes on. I think in my reread of this, I was actually falling asleep one afternoon when I was trying to read through this. So I don't know if that's my fault or the text's fault, but again, what I'm trying to do in these videos is talk through the reading experience, and it has to be admitted that sections of these are not very thrilling to read. Now, if you're not committed to reading every word of the Bible, you could easily just skip to the narratives, and a lot of people do. And then we also have a whole bunch of laws mixed in. So it'll go for laws for a little while, and then it'll break into the narrative, and then it'll go back to laws, and they'll break into a narrative. And I looked this up on Wikipedia to see if there was a rhyme or reason to when the sections of the laws were inserted where they were. I couldn't really find it. I'm going to talk mostly about the narrative because that's what's of interest to me. So the first thing to note, I guess, is none of this is historical. And interestingly enough, the Jerusalem Bible actually points that out with their footnote. Not historically accurate, talking about the numbers of the census. The figure implies that Israel's total population was 2,500,000. Saw a video of Bart Ehrman talking about this exact same thing on YouTube recently. I can't remember which video it was, but apparently, according to people who know this stuff, there is no way there was 2,500,000 people wandering around in the desert. First of all, Bart Ehrman says at that time in history there wouldn't have even been that many people in Egypt to begin with. So the Exodus, there's no way they could have all come out of Egypt. Second of all, I don't think that the desert could have supported that many people, and we would have had more archaeological evidence of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not to mention, the archaeological evidence has shown that the conquest of Canaan has not happened the way it was described in the Bible. So I mentioned I wasn't going to harp on the skeptical angle to this, but I think that does have to be forefronted when we talk about all of this, because if it didn't really happen, where does it come from? Or maybe some parts of it are historical and some parts are not, or there's real history mixed in with the mythology, etc. But by the way, something I should make clear with these numbers is that they're getting this number by extrapolating, because in the census they're counting all the men of fighting age. So there's some sort of calculation being that if these are the men of fighting age, then there must have been so many women and so many children and so many old men, etc. There is, I guess, since I just mentioned everything is open to debate, there is some attempt by conservative Christians to reconcile these numbers. by saying that maybe 1,000 in Hebrew numbers doesn't represent a literal 1,000, just means like a unit. I think that's an interpretation that has an ideological agenda, but I'm not sure how much weight, how much scholarly weight there is behind that. Okay, so census, the laws, mostly skipping through this. There is, okay, well, talking about the laws, a lot of this is dead boring. And again, I'm just talking about this in terms of the reading experience. But there is a couple little interesting things that come up here, and these are footnotes maybe with the Jerusalem Bible. Where is it? So it's talking about how to make a lustrum, a kind of healing potion made with the ashes of a red heifer. So if there's a red heifer without fault or blemish, you can mix in the ashes with different various things, and this will make some sort of a lustrum which has like purifying or healing powers. The Jerusalem Bible, and I don't know how they know this, but they footnote this, and they said this is an ancient half-magical custom, which is just kind of assimilated here into the Hebrew law to give it the status of Yahweh's law. So that was interesting. They don't. I'm not sure what the scholarship behind that is, but interesting. The other interesting thing is when we get to the sacrifices. Now, the book of Leviticus had regulated all sorts of sacrifices for atonement, sacrifices for, I don't know, being unclean or for inadvertently breaking the law or stuff like that. But in addition, there are all these regulations for just normal sacrifices, so like daily sacrifices. So every day, 2 yearling lambs without blemish as a perpetual holocaust. Now, again, if I'm remembering this correctly, a holocaust is when the animal is just completely consumed by the flame, so that there's nothing left to eat at the end. No part of you don't get to eat the meat. No part of it gets put to any good use. It's just the animal is completely consumed by the flame for God. Now, I mentioned before that the historical narrative in here isn't actually historical according to our archaeological evidence, but these were actually the laws that were governing the nation of Israel for a good part of its existence, meaning that presumably this was actually put into effect in the ancient kingdom of Israel or Judah. So every day, 2 yearling lambs are being sacrificed, and this is in addition to all the other atonement offerings. And on the Sabbath, you must offer 2 yearling lambs without blemish. I think this is in addition to the daily sacrifice. And then the Feast of the New Moon, Feast of the Unleavened Bread, Feast of the Weeks, Feast of the Acclamations, Feast of the Tabernacles, in which it lists all the sacrifices. And again, this gets to what I was saying before, where this is a little bit boring to read, but just reading the list of all the animals getting sacrificed. But this is a lot of animals getting sacrificed here, huh? Yeah. It strikes me as a bit of a waste. But although, again, I said I'm not going to bring in my modern day values when I'm trying to evaluate this. And to be fair, animal sacrifice was not unique to the ancient Israelites. The Greeks did it. And the book I'm reading here on ancient China, the Three Kingdoms, it talks about sacrifices they were doing over there. So I guess the Chinese did it as well. It was just a widespread practice in the ancient world. But this apparently was a practice which consumed, yeah, I mean, even putting aside the morality of killing animals, seemed to have consumed a fair amount of the wealth of the ancient world, right? So I thought that was interesting. Okay, but the narrative, the narrative is what interests me, being kind of a history and mythology geek. Numbers has, a lot of those stories about the ancient Israelites that you may remember from Sunday school, where the ancient Israelites are out in the desert and they're complaining to God, and God punishes them, and then they repent, and then they start complaining again, and God punishes them, and then they repent. They come from the book of Numbers, once we get past all these laws and enter into the narrative. So Israelites are out in the desert. They complain. People set up a lament which was offensive to Yahweh's ears. So he burned them, destroyed one end of the camp. People appealed to Moses and he interceded. Then they complain because they don't have any meat. Now, this part strikes me as strange because in the census, yeah, I guess maybe that's another thing I skipped over. In the census, it details a lot of the wealth that these various tribes have. Where is it? It talks about some of the cattle and livestock that they have. Talks about the dedication offering. Yeah, here it is. The dedication offering, where they are dedicating all these livestock to the dedication of the altar. So what are they doing complaining that they don't have any meat? I don't know if that's just a contradiction, and I know the Old Testament is full of these contradictions, or there's some extra explanation for that. But anyways, they're complaining that they have no meat. God gets angry. Moses intercedes. So God does give them the meat, but he's still angry. They got way too much meat, and for some reason, which is not clear in the text, they ate way too much. And I'm not sure if that's God forcing them to eat it, or if they just got greedy or something. It's one of, again, like I said, the text is full of these ambiguities. And then God sent a great plague. Aaron and Miriam complain, and Miriam gets struck down with leprosy, although she later repents and is forgiven. And then there's the famous story of the 12 tribes in Canaan. Sorry, the 12 spies in Canaan. So spy from each tribe goes into the land of Canaan. This is the land that God has promised them. And they come back, and all except for two, Joshua and Caleb, they say that we can't do it. They say, we saw giants there. We felt like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Now, this is a passage I remember from my Sunday school days and from my Bible school days. The 12 spies report that there are giants in the land of Canaan, and we felt like grasshoppers to them. Now, even my Bible school teachers never really explained if these were actual giants or if this was just an exaggeration by the spies. And we felt like grasshoppers. So as a kid, of course, I always pictured, giants like you get out of a cartoon, where they're just coming up to the giant's toe, and the giant is this huge beast. I'm not entirely sure even now if the author of the biblical narrative means us to assume that these types of giants are actually in there. Because, well, like I said, there's no right answer. Were these really giants or were they not? But because this was of interest to me, I looked up, it says the sons of Anak. So I looked up Anak on Wikipedia. It comes up a few times in the narrative, the Anakim, which I guess is the sons of Anak. And Anak is, what was the word? I think Wikipedia called it the Rephaim, which is, yeah, it says here, descendants of the giants, but apparently this word in the original Hebrew is the Nephilim. And the Nephilim are from Genesis 6, if you remember way back in Genesis 6. And I never realized there was this connection here because, as you can see in the English translation, it doesn't always come through. But the Nephilim were on the earth at that time. And the Nephilim are the sons of God and the daughters of men. And the sons of God is usually interpreted as being the angels. So this is not from Numbers. I'm jumping back in the Bible to Genesis. And this is directly preceding the flood. Now, I had always assumed that in the flood, all of the Nephilim got destroyed with every other living thing on the earth. So I don't know if count this as another contradiction, maybe, or maybe we're meant to assume, because it does say the Nephilim were on the earth at that time and even afterwards. So maybe some of the Nephilim survived. But there were giants apparently descended from the Nephilim, who are, I forgot to write down the word I learned on Wikipedia. It starts with an R, Rephaim or something like that. And that apparently, if you know what you're looking for, is all throughout the Old Testament. So, for example, I didn't realize this when I was reading Genesis, but in Genesis 14, when there is the campaign against the four great kings, these four great kings in Canaan are referred to by the name of the giants, the Rephaim. So this was apparently a war against the giants, apparently according to your interpretation of the Hebrew. Okay, so that's going to come up again a little bit later. So hopefully I'll remember to come up talk about that when we get to Og, king of Bashan. There's Israelites refuse, they get scared by the 10 spies who says they can't do it. They refuse to invade Canaan. And so God says, okay, well, fine. You're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all of you die out. And then your children will get the promised land, not you. And after they hear that, then they decide that they're sorry and they want to fight against the Canaanites after all, but God doesn't support them, so they get beaten back by the Amalekites and the Canaanites. So then they're wandering around in the desert, and we get a rebellion against the law. We get a rebellion against. Sorry. I skipped over something. Initially, God is really angry, and he wants to destroy them all. So he says, I will strike them of pestilence and disown them, and I shall make a new nation greater and mightier than they are. So he's going to make a new nation out of Moses. Now, Moses talks God out of this in what appears to be an appeal to God's reputation. So he said, the Egyptians already know that you brought these people out. And if you destroy them here in this desert, then all the other nations will say, Yahweh was not able to bring his people into the land he swore to give them. And so he had them slaughtered in the wilderness. The God of these passages, of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, this came up before in the book of Exodus. The God of these passages is very concerned with how the other nations view him. He doesn't want himself to lose face with the other nations, which again strikes me as an odd thing for God to be concerned about. But again, I said I wasn't going to be overly skeptical about these passages. But what's interesting about this is God actually takes Moses' point. And so he says, okay, I will forgive them as you ask. And this is a famously problematic theological passage for Christians and I guess presumably Jews as well, because it appears to show a God who is not omniscient, a God whom, right, in Christian theology, God knows the past, present, and future. He knows everything that has happened, everything that is happening, and everything that will happen. And so you can't out-logic God. You can't say to God, well, have you thought of this? And then God says, oh, no, I never thought of that. But it appears to be what's going on here, although, again, it's a little bit open to interpretation. Now, this has been long discussed by theologians, and in fact, I think this is my earliest memory of a theological discussion. It was a Bible study for the adults at our church, and for whatever reason, there was nowhere for the kids to go at the time. So I was just sitting next to my dad as my dad discussed this passage with the other people in his Bible study. And I was just listening to what they were saying. I must have been around 6 or 7 years old. And I remember some of the men saying that perhaps it didn't actually happen like this. That this was, whatever happened was maybe too complex for us to understand. And so the Bible was written, the Bible, the argument goes that the Bible is written for us to understand. It's not actually, may not be literally true in all of these interactions because God is way too complex for our puny human brain to understand. And that stuck in my mind because it was the first indication to me that the Bible was not true in all of its little details, which was more or less the view of the Bible that I was raised with in that church. So yeah, there are numerous different explanations or ways out of this sticky little theological problem, but it is a sticky little theological problem. Okay, then we get to the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. If memory serves, it's normally referred to as the rebellion of Korah when it comes up again later. Korah seems to be the name most associated with it. So there's a rebellion against Moses. And at this point, you really think the Israelites would have learned their lesson. But again, I think that the author of this book really wants to make a point. So they keep rebelling against God. They keep getting punished. And it's somehow this rebellion manages to attract a lot of the leading families of Israel. Leaders of the community, prominent in solemn feasts, men of repute. Now, again, it was mentioned earlier in the census about all the leaders of these communities. And you think to yourself, this was a generation that was slaves in Egypt. How did they get, leaders of their communities. It's something that comes up a lot in the book of Numbers, talking about the different heads of tribes or leaders. I'm not sure if it's another contradiction or whatever. But yeah, God sends down fire. Moses and Aaron, I think, intercede so that the whole of Israel is not destroyed. But the earth opens up, and Korah's men and all their belongings went down alive to Sheol. Which is the underworld, the place of the dead. So in the Old Testament, there's not a heaven and hell. That doesn't come along till later. The Old Testament just refers to Sheol. I think it's kind of like Hades, just like a generic land of the dead, which I guess, as you can see, is located somewhere underground in this view of the world. All right. Then Moses and Aaron. Yeah, this is another passage where the narrative is very ambiguous. So you have to kind of put together what happened here. The Israelites don't have water. They ask for water. God says, take a branch, call the community together, you and your brother Aaron. Then in view of them, order this rock to give water. You will make the water flow out of the rock and provide drink for the community and their cattle. Moses took up the branch from before Yahweh as he had directed him. Then Moses and Aaron called the assembly together in front of the rock and addressed them. Listen now, you rebels. Shall we make water gush from this rock for you? And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the branch. Water gushed in abundance, and the community drank, and their cattle too. Then Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe that I could proclaim my holiness in the eyes of the sons of Israel, you shall not lead the assembly into the land I am giving them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the sons of Israel challenged Yahweh, and he proclaimed his holiness. So, again, you really feel like you need somebody to fill in the details for you about what happened here. And the details I got growing up in the church was that Moses and Aaron got angry because they were sick of the Israelites complaining. Because they got angry, they struck the rock rather than talk to it. I believe... Sorry, I should have looked this up before filming, but I forgot. I think earlier in the narrative, there was another time where God commanded them to strike the rock, and it gave forth water. That may have been somewhere in the book of Exodus, or I could be remembering wrong. But here, they're commanded to talk to the rock. I'm not, why it makes a difference. Who knows? But this is the reason that Moses and Aaron are not allowed to go into the promised land, the land of Canaan. So they too will die before they get to the land of Canaan. Interesting footnote here in the Jerusalem Bible. It says, no explanation of the offense of Moses and Aaron is given here. I mean, it seems to imply that they're not being let in because they struck the rock. But it is ambiguous, if you just read the words. In Deuteronomy 1:37, it is the abandonment of the campaign against Canaan that brings on this punishment. And that it's possible that this verse relates to chapter 14, not the Meribah incident. So chapter 14 is the rebellion of Israel because the 10 spies who brought back the reports of the giants in Canaan. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, who knows? It does somewhere in a later passage, and I don't remember where, but somewhere later in Numbers, though, it does reiterate that Moses is being punished for what happened at the waters of Meribah. So I'm not sure I agree with this footnote entirely. It does later in Numbers, it does make that connection. But again, the Bible scholars who write these footnotes know more than me. All right. Sorry, just going to grab a drink of water here. Talking too much. Then we have the conquest of the Transjordan. So, in this case, it's really useful to have some maps. And there are no maps in this Bible, unfortunately, although plenty of Bibles do have maps. This is one where it would be really useful. So I've gone to the internet. Pardon this bad camera work, but this here is from History in the Bible podcast, who have a map of what's going on here. So this is the land of Canaan here. This is the promised land. So they are not allowed to enter that land because they rebelled against God. So they do not go into that land, but they go over here, and they are going to interact with the people in these lands. Edom, Moab, Bashan over here, the Amorites over here, and the Midianites who are down here. So that's the geography to keep in mind in this next part. I almost skipped over a couple of different things. The death of Aaron. So Aaron dies, and then the priesthood is inherited by his sons, his two surviving sons, because two of his sons were killed off in the book of Leviticus for offering fire to Yahweh that Yahweh had not called for. Little digression here about the capture of a Canaanite town after one of the Canaanite kings attacks Israel. And then the story of the bronze serpent. So this is yet another example of the Israelites crying out against God. Once again, they never seem to learn their lesson. And then God punishes them with serpents. And then Moses fashioned a bronze serpent, which he put on a standard, like a stick. And anyone who was bitten by the serpent looked at the bronze serpent and lived. And that's why, if you see that snake wrapped around the stick, which is the symbol of the medical profession, I believe, that's where this comes from. Christians also believe this was a foreshadowing of Christ, because the snake up on a stick was like a Christ up on the cross. Okay, so they go to the Transjordan, and they go to Edom. So Edom's here. The natural thing would be to go through here with Edom. And they make an offer. They say, "We will pass through your land. We will not cross any fields or vineyards. We will not drink any water from the well." So they just want to pass through Edom. The king of Edom refuses and comes out with his army. And so Israel turns away. You can see in this map here, they do not, well, there's a couple different routes here because I guess it's a bit ambiguous, but they do not go through Edom. They go around Edom. But then we have a similar passage when they get to the land of the Amorites. So the Israel wants to go through. They're not going to touch anything, keep to the king's frontiers. But the king of the Amorites comes out with his army. And instead of just going around like they did with Edom, they fight and conquer the Amorites. So what's the difference? Well, again, the text doesn't say, so we're left to the interpretation. The interpretation that I remember from my second grade Bible teacher, which for whatever reason is stuck in my mind, is that Edom is a close cousin to Israel. Edom is descended from Esau, who was the brother of Jacob, who was the patriarch of Esau. So they are cousins of sorts, at least in the biblical narrative. So God says, okay, you're not going to fight them. There's in Deuteronomy, I was somewhat actually surprised to see that this was not in the text. It was so strong in my memory. It's like that a lot reading the Bible. You're surprised at all these things that you hear in Sunday school are not actually in the text. But there is something looking ahead to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, they do recount these same stories here about the conquest of the Transjordan, with a little bit of the details being changed, or maybe the emphasis being different. And here in Deuteronomy, it quite clearly says that God has given this land to the sons of Esau, so you are not to fight it. But apparently King Shehem of the Amorites is under no such protection, so the Israelites do fight and destroy him. And this is one of the reasons why I find the Old Testament narrative so fascinating, is these little historical details. Now, like I said, none of this is really historical, but you can't help but wonder whether little bits of actual history work their way into this mythology. And I'm sure there's been so much study on this by biblical scholars that I'm just not even aware of. But unfortunately, you can't look up everything, huh? I'm just a casual reader of this. But so Israelites took all the Amorite towns, Heshbon's and all the towns in its jurisdiction. Now, Heshbon was the capital of Shihon. Shihon is the king of the Amorites. And this same Shihon, before the Israelites showed up, had waged war on the king of Moab. Again, Moab is down here. I guess the Amorite kingdom is up here. And he had conquered Moab as far as Arnon. Arnon is over here, I guess. So hence the poets sing. And then we've got this little song, which I guess comes from the ancient poets, about how Shihon conquered the Amorites. Now this is nothing to do with the Israelites. This apparently is about the conquest of Shihon, king of the Amorites, against the kingdom of Moab before the Israelites even showed up. But somebody thought that it was worth preserving this in the Bible, and so we got this wonderful little insight into the ancient Near Eastern history. Courage, Heshbon, well built and well founded, city of Shihon. For a fire came out of Heshbon, a flame from the city of Shihon. It devoured Ar of Moab and engulfed the heights of Arnon. Woe to you, Moab! You are lost, people of Chemosh. I think Chemosh is the Moabite god. It just goes on about how Shehem of the Amorites has destroyed Moab. And it's just, and again, who knows what the actual history of this is? Maybe this was. So I think it's universally agreed that the Israelites did not actually go this way, as depicted in the book of Numbers. But the poem comes from somewhere, huh? I find those kind of details really interesting. Okay, so then we get to the famous story of Balaam and Balak, and this actually confused me as a kid. One of my embarrassing moments as a young adolescent in 7th grade was actually talking about this story to my Bible teacher and completely mixing up Balaam and Balak. But the names look so similar, right? So Balak is the king of Moab. Balaam is a prophet who lives in the area. What is Balaam? I forget. It looks like he's maybe from Midian. We'll come back to the difference between Midian and Moab in a little bit. Now, there's a footnote here from the Jerusalem Bible that says, in this story, there are materials from two different traditions, not always consistent with one another, which is something I hadn't known before. And or if I had known it, I had long forgotten. And again, I don't think I'd read this story in its entirety since I was back in seventh grade. But this is something that Christine Hayes talks about in her lectures on the Old Testament, and other people have mentioned this as well. The editors will sometimes put side-by-side stories from two separate traditions so you can see the contradictions right next to each other. There's a very obvious contradiction where Balaam says to Balak that he's not going to go. So Balaam would not come with us because God has told him not to go. So even if Balak gave me his house full of silver and gold, I would not go against the order of Yahweh my God in anything great or small. So he says he's not coming. And then after all that, the next morning he just gets up and he goes. And so I think that, I suspect that's one of the contradictions they're talking about here. Although they don't actually spell out what the inconsistencies are in this footnote, so you've got to kind of look and find them yourself. But this is, if you remember from your Sunday school days, this is the famous story about the talking donkey. What's also interesting about this story is Balaam is, throughout this narrative, it's made clear, it seems to be emphasized over and over again that Yahweh is the God of the Israelites, and the other nations may have their own gods, but they're not favored by Yahweh. But here, Balaam, although he is not an Israelite, is a prophet of Yahweh. So he is able to give out Yahweh's words. Balak, the king of the Moabites, wants Balaam to curse the Israelites, but Balaam does not curse the Israelites. And again, there's in these different... Sorry, let me back up. Balaam is asked to curse the Israelites. He doesn't. Instead, he gives them blessings, either because God forces them to, like he tries to curse them and he just can't, or because he doesn't dare disobey what God tells him to do. There's some interesting historical stuff in here if you look it up on Wikipedia. For example, his king is greater than Agag. What is Agag? It doesn't say, no footnote here. Looked it up on Wikipedia. Agag is, well, again, nobody knows. It's like so much of the stuff in here. But possibly, according to one interpretation, is the hereditary king of the Amalekites. Just like you have the pharaohs in Egypt, you have Agag in the Amalek, was the hereditary king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites don't only picture very little bit in numbers, but they're have an interesting place in the Old Testament because throughout the biblical narrative, God has commanded the Israelites to wipe out all the Amalekites. I think so interesting. Okay. Then we get to Israel at Peor. Sorry, I'm going to need more water. Sorry, I know I've been talking too much, but there's just so much interesting stuff to talk about. So Israel settles at Shittim, which is, I guess, in near the Moab area. And they give themselves over to debauchery with the daughters of Moab. So Israel is having sex with the daughters of Moab. Is not good because they're supposed to stay away from Moab. But then, as we go through this, it switches from Moab back to Midian. So it's some sort of women are the problem, but it's unclear if it's the Moab women or the Midianite women. So I look this up on Wikipedia, search Google, is Moab and Midian the same? And once again, got many different answers. It turns out I was not the only person who had this question. There are lots of people asking on different internet forums about what's going on here. What's the difference between Moab and Midian? Some people said that Moab and Midian were an alliance. Some people said it was similar to the United Kingdoms, where there were different peoples under one monarch. I got various different answers on that. But Moab and Midian are distinct. Midian, I think, is, if I'm remembering right, is one of the descendants of Abraham. Moab is one of the descendants of Lot through that famous story of incest, where Lot's daughter had sex with him way back in Genesis. But they're having sex with the women of Midian. God's not happy about this. It's a little bit ambiguous whether the racial mixing is a problem itself. And again, the commentary disagrees on this. One commentary I looked up even suggested that part of the problem was that Midian may be too incestuous, because it's another descendant of Abraham, so maybe it's the incestuousness. The sacrifices of their gods is mentioned up at the beginning, but then as we go down through the text, sometimes that's not reiterated, and it appears that the women are problems in and of themselves just for being Moabites or Midianites. Again, another theme that's going to come up throughout the Old Testament is prohibition against the mixing of the peoples. But God strikes them down with a plague. The Phinehas, the priest of the son of Eliezer, grabs his spear and strikes through Zimri, who was one of the leaders of the patriarchal houses of Simeon. Again, I'm a little bit... Wikipedia refers to Zimri as a prince. I guess that must just be a difference in translation. But yeah, again, I'm wondering how the society became so structured when they just are coming out of slavery. But yeah, he runs a spear through him and the Midianite woman. And then this sets up that the Midianites are going to... The Midianites have sinned against God, and they are going to get their retribution. So, but we have to put a pin in that, because we get more laws and another census. So here's another census. So put the narrative on hold. More census, more regulations for sacrifices. This is what I talked about before. Again, why this is inserted here, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, the holy war against Midian. So again, Midian is not on this particular map, but on another map I looked at earlier, which I don't have up with me here. I think Midian is supposed to be down here somewhere. So they have a holy war against Midian, which Yahweh commands them. You get the impression that Midian is just completely wiped out. They took everyone captive, killed everyone, blah, 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 blah. But Midian is not gone from the biblical narrative. It's going to pop up in later books and later chapters. So I guess either this is a contradiction, or we're meant to assume that was just a portion of Midian that was wiped out. And then we get to one of the more infamous passages of the Bible, which is the allocation of the Midianites' virgins. So Moses was enraged with the captains of the army because they had spared a lot of the Midianites. He said, "Why have you spared the life of all the women? They were the very ones who on Balaam's advice perverted the sons of Israel and made them renounce Yahweh in the fair at Peorah, hence the plague which struck the community of Israel. So kill all the male children, kill also all the women who have slept with a man, spare the lives only of the young girls who have not slept with a man, and take them for yourselves." So this is something that skeptics of the Bible have picked on as a seeming example of sexual slavery. I think Thomas Paine phrased it something like it's a commandment to slaughter the boys, kill the mothers, and debauch the virgins, or debauch the women. Christopher Hitchens picked up on that passage of Thomas Paine and made a big deal about it in his book as well. Religious people have argued back against it, saying it's not clear that this is meant to be they're being spared for sexual purposes. The conclusion I've come to, again, in line with everything I've been discovering about the Bible as I've reread it, is it is ambiguous. And I don't think you can say with certainty either interpretation. I think Christopher Hitchens and Thomas Paine, even though I was enamored with them when I read their books, Thomas Paine especially, I've got to say, upon rereading this in context, you could make the case that it's not at all clear that this is sexual slavery going on. On the other hand, it could be. What also is not at all clear is what is happening to these women, because of all the booty, a certain portion of it is sacrificed to Yahweh, so including the women. So Yahweh's portion, Yahweh gets like a tenth of this. So it talks about all the booty which is given, and it's offered up to Yahweh. And it talks about the share of the women as well. Where is that? Sorry, the women are definitely mentioned here. 16,000 persons, of which Yahweh's portion was 32. So of these women who have never slept with a man who are being spared, a portion of that, was it 10%? I forget, are given to Yahweh, and it's heavily implied they're getting sacrificed because they're getting offered up to Yahweh. So I looked this up on Wikipedia. They have I think a whole chapter, a whole Wikipedia entry on Numbers 31 in the war against Midian, and no surprises here. It is ambiguous. There are some interpretations where this is an example of human sacrifice in the Old Testament. And despite the fact that the general tenor of the Old Testament is against the human sacrifice, this is something that's normally associated with the evil Canaanites and not with Yahweh, there are some instances in the Old Testament where it does appear that Yahweh is endorsing human sacrifice. Christopher Hitchens knows these passages very well. Yeah, possibly. It's ambiguous here. I completely forgot something. This is a problem with doing these things unscripted. Bear with me as we backtrack here to the conquest of the Amorites. You remember that? That was the Amorites here. They wouldn't let Israel march through, so Israel conquered them. After that, Og from Bashan, who I guess is somewhere over here. Where's Bashan? Somewhere over here, came down to attack the Israelites. So there's another war against the people of Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, marched out to meet them, and it's only given a very short, a very short few verses in the book of Numbers. But this is later in the Bible. Look back at one of Israel's great victories, in addition to defeating Shion the Amorite. So very little press here, but it gets recounted several times later in the Bible, the conquest of Og, king of Bashan. And it's not mentioned here, but in other parts of the Bible, like in Deuteronomy, Og is one of the giants, one of the, Rephaim, the one that starts with an R. And it is described how his bed was 9 cubits or something like that. He had a very famous bed, which was really huge because he was such a giant man. So so Og, the one of the ancient giants of the land of Canaan, mentioned just briefly here, but later very important. According to Wikipedia, he's also a figure in the Quran. So it's again. The biblical narrative really does not give you very much to work with here, but this is the bare bones of what would later become more elaborate traditions in both the